Anytime I talk about feminist theology or black theology or womanist theology or something like this, somebody in the comments inevitably says something like, well, what about Christian theology? What about Jesus? What about the gospel? And I think this comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of how these categories work and how these categories relate to other categories in theological study. So I figure I'd do a quick video talking about how several of these different kinds of theology relate to Christian theology. So let's start at the top and zoom out as far as possible and talk about theology in very general terms. Theology in general is God talk, or discourse about God, or when we're talking about academic study, the study of the nature of God and God's relationship to the world. If we then zoom into theology, the first distinction we need to make is between different religious traditions. So we have Christian theology and Jewish theology and Islamic theology and Hindu theology and as many other kinds of theology as there are religious traditions in the world, which is to say quite a few. Then once we zoom into Christian theology, we have a variety of different kinds of theology which are defined primarily in terms of their scope and what they hope to accomplish. And this is where we're going to get categories like systematic theology, dogmatic theology, biblical theology, historical theology, constructive theology, contextual theology, pastoral theology, practical theology, and public theology. Of these categories, systematic theology is probably the kind most familiar to the most people, and systematic theology attempts to give a complete and coherent account of all Christian claims about reality. Systematic theology itself then breaks down into several more categories, usually 7 to 10, depending on who's making the list. I usually think of it as 8, 4 relating primarily to God and 4 primarily relating to human beings. The 4 that are primarily related to God are theology proper, usually related to the nature of God the Father or the entire Trinity taken together, Christology related to the nature of Jesus, pneumatology related to the nature of the Holy Spirit, and then either angelology or demonology related to the nature of other supernatural beings. Then the 4 that have more to do with human beings are what's called theological anthropology, talking about the nature of human beings and how we relate to God, ecclesiology, the nature of the church, soteriology, the nature of salvation, and then eschatology, the nature of the end times, how all of this is going to work out. Several of these other theological categories that have to do with scope can also be broken down in a similar manner. For example, you can break down historical theology into different historical periods, patristic theology, medieval theology, early modern theology, postmodern theology, etc. But the theological category that we're most interested in for this video is contextual theology, which defines a scope of theological practice that relates to a specific community's social and historical experience. And it's in this category of contextual theology that you'll find things like feminist theology, black theology, Latin American liberation theology, womanist theology, mujerista theology, Asian and Asian American theology, Native American theology, queer theology, etc. So even though you may be less familiar with these categories in contextual theology, and even though these categories in contextual theology are very different from the categories in systematic theology that you might be more familiar with, these are nevertheless, by and large, Christian kinds of theology. So feminist theology, black theology, womanist theology, these are all, by and large, as Christian as all these other kinds of Christian theology that I've talked about. And they are as much about Jesus, as much about the New Testament, as much about the gospel as any of these other categories of Christian theology. It's always important to keep in mind that just because something is unfamiliar to you doesn't mean that it's opposed to you in some way.